To this point, we spent nearly the entire quarter in the Roman world of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. And this is a comfortable place, and I'm sure at this point we're all very comfortable with it. And there's a reason for this. The 1st century brought the Augustan peace, a period of time interrupted only by a brief civil war in the year 69 AD. This was the age of Jesus and the apostles. The peace, stability, and prosperity of the 1st century was, in some ways, the most important miracle that permitted Christianity's explosive growth. And then following that 1st century AD was the Antonine Age. And this is the period in which Plutarch and Suetonius wrote, a period of even greater prosperity and stability. It was the Antonine Age that the great English historian Edward Gibbon called the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. This, without hesitation, one would name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus, 96 to 180 AD. Now, I've already seen how this prosperity and stability affected the political and literary ideas of Plutarch and Suetonius. But it wasn't just Gibbon who thought that this was the best possible moment in history. The people living through it called it this as well. So the Antonine Age is dominated by 5 emperors who are called subsequently the 5 good emperors. And they're Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. The last Antonine emperor, though, has not historically come down as a good emperor. This was Commodus. Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius, who's also the villain in the movie Gladiator. But Commodus was not nearly as bad in life as he was in the movie. He was sort of a blend of Caligula and Domitian, with a little more Caligula than Domitian. But when he died, the nature of imperial power changed. He was succeeded by a dark-skinned North African named Septimius Severus. The Severus was a soldier, and he took power because of his military background. Initially, he tried to make nice with the Senate, but they were suspicious of an outsider, and they began trying to oppose Severus covertly. And so Severus then turned heavily towards the army. He began giving them raises, paying bonuses, and charging senators more taxes to pay for this. The dynasty he founded would last for 42 years, beginning in 193 and lasting until 235. And it was characterized by repeated appeals to the army. But when the last member of the dynasty fell, it was because of a military revolt led by a general. That general was Maximinus Thrax, who you see on the upper register there. The army had become so used to serving as the power brokers in the empire that they no longer immediately assumed that the emperors could really say no to them. The Senate did not agree with this, and they refused to support the new emperor, so instead they put up their own emperors. And what followed was a 50-year-long contest in which the Senate and the armies went back and forth, proclaiming emperors and watching the other side take those emperors down, and then doing this dance all over again. So between 235 and 284, there are over 60 men who claim to be emperors, more than one a year. And this ends only in 284 when an army general named Diocletian takes over. This is Diocletian. Now, Diocletian was a genius. He was a soldier born in what is now Croatia, and he understood fundamentally what the problems were with the Roman Empire. Augustus had designed the empire to be a loosely run place in which most local officials were permitted to do whatever their cities wanted, as long as this didn't challenge imperial rule directly, or if it was a new initiative, as long as it had imperial approval to begin. And this worked because in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome could afford to be inefficient. It was so much more powerful than anyone around it that it didn't really need to maximize the resources available in the empire. And so in a sense, it was deliberately running the empire and fighting its enemies with one hand tied behind its back so the body would not get too tired. But in the 3rd century, Goths along the northern frontier and Persians in the east began organizing very severe threats. The empire then needed more resources and needed to ask more of its citizens. But this also meant that citizens expected more in return. And Diocletian realized that the 3rd century crisis was partly a result of citizens giving more to Rome and getting less in return. His solution then was to divide imperial power so that there would be more emperors, and each could focus on the interests of a portion of the empire. That way citizens would get what they were paying for. So instead of trying to run the empire himself, what Diocletian did was he delegated authority and divided supreme authority. He appointed, in the end, 3 colleagues to run the thing with him. And the organization he created was called the Tetrarchy. This means literally the rule of 4. 2 of the emperors would be senior emperors, called Augusti, and 2 of the emperors would be junior emperors, called Caesars. And each one would be in charge of one part of the empire, and each would have their own capital. And so this is a map showing how the empire was divided and what the capitals of the various members of the imperial college, how they were divided. Now, to make their jobs easier, Diocletian also began a series of reforms that remade how the empire worked. So he changed the tax system so it was more efficient and took into account how much tax people could pay. He made a new coinage based on a solid gold coin called the solidus, and he reformed the administrative system so that the empire went from having 60 relatively big provinces to 180 smaller, more easily administered provinces. And so this is a map of the Roman world in the 4th century. Diocletian's efforts to remake the Roman world using imperial power ran smack into the growth of Christianity. The Christianity that Paul and the apostles began preaching to non-Jews in the 1st century had spread dramatically by the end of the 3rd century. By the year 300, it's estimated that maybe 10% of the entire Roman population was Christian. So this is a huge number, maybe 6 million people across the empire. And it's further estimated that Christianity was growing at a very fast pace. And part of this had to do with the great success of texts like the Gospels. Part of it had to do with missionary activity on the part of Christians, but part of it had to do with the fact that despite what Christian sources say, Christianity had been allowed to grow this fast. So when we think of Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, what we're tempted to think about is this kind of scene, right? Christians being thrown to the lions. And I'm not going to tell you this is complete fiction. Persecution did happen, but persecution is relatively rare. So to give you a sense of how rare, in the year 112, when he was serving under the Emperor Trajan, the senator Pliny was forced to decide a case in which a number of Christians were brought to him. Now, Pliny was put in this position governing this territory because the territory had been badly run by many administrators in the past. And so Pliny was sent as a senior and experienced administrator to try to deal with all of the administrative issues that had been left over from previous governors. And so it's very interesting that this senior administrator would say, "I've never been present at any legal examination of the Christians, and I don't know, therefore, what are the usual penalties passed on them or the limits of those penalties or how the inquiry should be made." So this is particularly interesting because this is one of the most experienced administrators in the empire in 112, and yet he doesn't know anything about how one conducts an examination of Christians. And so what this suggests quite strongly is that these things are not happening very regularly. Pliny is asking for guidance because this happens so rarely that most administrators never see it ever. And so that suggests that large-scale persecutions of Christians in the 2nd century are not happening at all. They are very sporadic affairs that arise in very rare instances. But by the middle of the 3rd century, things begin to change. In 249, the Emperor Decius issued a law requiring everyone in the empire to sacrifice and get a receipt that says that they've done so. The idea seems to be that Decius thought that the 3rd century crisis was occurring because people were lazy and the gods were getting angry. And so he wanted to force people to do their sacrifices and make the gods happy. What he doesn't seem to have realized is that many Christians obviously won't comply with this order. And so this ends up being the first empire-wide persecution of Christians, but it wasn't actually designed to be an empire-wide persecution of Christians. It was instead designed to be something that encouraged pagans to sacrifice. But the persecution ends at any rate in 251 when Decius dies in battle with the Goths, the first Roman emperor to die in battle with barbarians. So obviously the gods were not too happy with him. But the second persecution starts later in the 250s when the Emperor Valerian reinstates this law of Decius. It ends when Valerian gets captured by the Persians and is made to serve as a footstool for the Persian king for the rest of his life, until he was flayed alive, at least one of our sources say. So obviously he's the first Roman emperor to be treated in this way. After that, not surprisingly, emperors stopped persecuting for a while, and what follows is 45 years called the Little Peace of the Church. Christianity is effectively legalized, Big churches are built, including one right outside of the window of Diocletian's palace, but this little piece of the church ends rather abruptly under the Tetrarchs. And at first glance, this is probably pretty surprising, because what would Christianity have to do with the sorts of things the Tetrarchs are interested in? Things like tax policies and provincial reform. The immediate answer is not much, but if we take a step back, we can actually see that Christianity and its place has quite a bit to do with the success of these projects. Because if we remember how traditional paganism worked, you sacrificed to the gods to ensure that the gods remained happy with what was going on in Roman society. And Christians are not allowed to sacrifice to the gods. Now, to Diocletian, this would seem like a problem, because administration of the empire also had a religious component. Religion and politics are not separate, and an empire succeeds only if the gods allow it to succeed. And so for the Tetrarchs, the success of the empire actually depended, the continued success of the empire actually depended on them encouraging Christians, encouraging everybody to keep the gods happy. And so Diocletian and his colleagues initiate a persecution of the church because they're trying to reform all aspects of life in the empire, and interactions with the gods are one of the very important things that the Roman state regulates. But the persecution is much more systematic than anything that came before it. They don't go after individual Christians. They don't care about the regular old random Christian down the street. What they do is they go after bishops and church property. And the idea was to cut Christianity down by attacking its leaders and confiscating the property that belongs to the church. And the Tetrarchs stick with this persecution far longer than Decius or Valerian did. The Great Persecution begins in 303, and it lasts in fits and starts until 312. This is a much more systematic and much more damaging persecution than anything that came before it. And it's important to emphasize, the Great Persecution is the backdrop both to the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity and the story that Eusebius, who is his biographer, wants to tell. So if this is the background, who is Constantine? So Constantine is the son of Constantius, the Tetrarch who was put in charge of the northwest of the Roman Empire. In 305, Diocletian and his senior emperor colleague Maximian retired, and the junior emperors, Constantius and Galerius, were promoted to senior emperors. When Diocletian and Maximian retire, Constantine's father becomes senior emperor, but he dies soon after this. And this is a bit of a problem, because in the Tetrarchic system, the goal was actually for emperors to serve as a senior emperor for 10 years and then retire and be replaced by a junior colleague. The three remaining emperors, if one died, would have to have a meeting and try to appoint a new junior emperor after elevating whoever the junior emperor serving under the senior emperor was. But Constantius' death posed a particular problem because of his son Constantine. Now, Constantine had been raised with Constantius' army, and then he was summoned away by Diocletian, but then ultimately returned to the army. And so this is how Eusebius describes this. He describes basically Diocletian summoning Constantine away because he's jealous of the reputation that Constantine is building, but then Constantine becomes aware of this and he flees the court of Diocletian. Now, in practice, what Diocletian was doing by summoning Constantine was basically trying to prevent Constantine from building such a following with his father's army that he might try to seize power outside of the Tetrarchic system. And it turns out that the problem Diocletian was looking to address was very real, because when Constantine's father died, the army proclaimed Constantine emperor. Now, the other Tetrarchs had appointed a man named Severus as Caesar under Constantius. And so in their mind, when Constantius died, Severus was supposed to assume power as senior emperor. And this prompted a standoff, because Constantius's troops had named Constantine senior emperor, not just part of the Imperial College, but senior emperor. And so they had pulled off the very coup that Diocletian feared. But it was a very strategic step by Constantine, because what he could then do was negotiate down from the position of senior emperor and come to an agreement with Severus, where he would accept the title of junior emperor and allow Severus to ascend to the position of senior emperor. And this is in fact what happened in 306. But the fact that Constantine had done this created other problems, because there was another son of a member of the Tetrarchy, a man named Maxentius, and he too was known to his father's army. He was the son of Maximian, who had resigned under Diocletian, and Maxentius also managed to get their loyalty. And so he arranged the army to rebel against Severus, proclaim him emperor, and then he worked to have Severus killed. And once this happened, Constantine apparently decided that the Tetrarchy was doomed, and he decided to try to grab as much power as he could before someone came after him. And so ultimately this led him to declare war on Maxentius, who wasn't recognized as legitimate by the other tetrarchs and therefore was fair game. So Eusebius, who's Constantine's biggest defender, adopts this line in describing the campaign that Constantine launched. He said that Constantine regarded the entire world as one immense body, and he perceived that the head of it all, the royal city of the Roman Empire, was bowed down by the weight of a tyrannous oppression. At first, he'd not left the task of liberation to those who governed the other divisions of the empire, because they were his superiors in point of age. But when none of these proved able to afford relief, and those who'd attempted it had experienced a disastrous termination of their enterprise, Constantine said that life was without enjoyment to him as long as he saw the imperial city afflicted, and he prepared himself for the overthrow of tyranny. And so Eusebius then justifies Constantine's decision to attack Maxentius by pointing out that Maxentius had taken power illegally, and therefore he needed to be stopped. Now Constantine, as the most junior member of the Imperial College, had first waited for his superiors to do something, but when they couldn't get rid of Maxentius, Constantine felt that he had no choice but to act on his own. And this is a great story, and it's a story that is in one way completely true. Constantine did wait for others to act against Maxentius, and Maxentius was legally a tyrant because he exercised power without the legal justification and authority given to him by the other tetrarchs. But in practice, Constantine really wanted to attack Maxentius because he wanted to take over the quarter of the empire that Maxentius held. And this was a power grab by Constantine, a way to increase his share of territory, and in so doing, overturn part of the principles on which the Tetrarchy was working. But this is at any rate the background to one of the most famous events in all of Roman history. This is the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312. Now the battle itself is less significant than the events that preceded it. Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, describes the scene quite vividly. Constantine was convinced that he needed some more powerful aid than his military forces could afford him, and so he sought divine assistance, believing the cooperating power of deity to be invincible and not easily shaken. Now, the issue here is that Constantine is invading Italy against an emperor who has fought off other invasions of Italy, has fortified most of the major centers of power in Italy, and has roughly the same number of troops that Constantine does, except that Constantine cannot bring all of those troops to attack Maxentius, because he still has to defend the territory that is his own, the northwest of the empire. And so Constantine has legitimate reason to be afraid about what will happen during this campaign. He also understands that if he loses, it's quite likely that he could die. When Severus challenged Maxentius, he died. When Galerius challenged Maxentius, he barely escaped Italy on his own without losing his life. And so Constantine has a legitimate reason to be scared. And so before the battle, what we're told is Constantine decided to turn towards the Christian God in order to ensure the success of his campaign. But then to be sure that the choice that he made was correct, Constantine asked God for a message, and he got an image of the cross in the sky. And Eusebius then describes what follows. In his sleep, Christ appeared to him with the same sign which he'd seen in the heavens, and commanded him to make a likeness of that sign and to use it as a safeguard in all of his engagements with his enemies. And so Constantine sees this vision in the sky. It's confirmed by this dream in which Jesus appears to him, and he's given an explicit command to make the sign that he saw in the heavens and place it on the shields of his soldiers as they fight. And the Italian campaign then follows, culminating in the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Now, as you know, Constantine and his forces were victorious at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and Maxentius' forces were eliminated. And Constantine then controlled the western half of the empire. But what's also important to understand about the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is Maxentius' behavior at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge made no sense to anyone. Because in that battle, Maxentius marched out from the well-fortified and well-supplied city of Rome. He had never done this in the previous attacks against him. And when he went over to meet Constantine's forces, he first crossed the Tiber River, and then, when his forces had no retreat, he allowed them to be boxed in at this sort of location where they did not have enough room to maneuver. And what resulted was a massacre. The troops were cut apart, and Maxentius himself went into the river and drowned. This is something that everybody, from Constantine on down, struggled to make sense of, except Constantine had an explanation. Constantine's explanation was, of course, this: that Christ had appeared to him, and Christ had seen that he would win this battle. And so following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine and the man who was on his way to taking control of the eastern part of the empire, a man named Licinius, issued an edict of toleration that restored Christian property that had been confiscated during the persecutions and ended all attacks on Christians. And following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine's position became one of coexistence with Licinius. And it was secured with a marriage alliance between Licinius and Constantine's sister. But from 313 until 324, this alliance was really challenged, and the relationship deteriorated until in 324, Constantine defeated the forces of Licinius. Licinius was killed, and from 324 to 337, Constantine ruled as sole emperor of the Roman Empire. And this is, of course, a major victory for the Christian church, because Constantine meant that persecution would not return. He restored Christian property, he made Christian worship free, he allowed Christians to again be publicly active without threat. And in these policies, we can see the Christianity of Constantine begin to be reflected. But it took some time for this to be officially reflected in Constantine's propaganda. And the official process of Christianizing Constantine's image is slow. So from 306 to 308, Constantine presents himself as a tetrarch, one of the people who formed a part of Diocletian's group of emperors. And so this is a coin of Constantine. You can see on the back the god Jupiter holding the Palladium, or a victory, and this is a very traditional pagan way of representing imperial power. And of course, the portraiture of Constantine matches up very closely with that of Diocletian. And so the message that Constantine is sending initially is that he's part of this pagan tetrarchic arrangement. By 310, he begins to take a different approach. You can see that the portraiture in 310 is individualized. He no longer looks the same as the other emperors, but you also can see that on the back of the coin is still a pagan god. In this case, though, it's not Jupiter, it's the sun god, Sol Invictus. Constantine at this point is presenting an individualized self-image, but he is still presenting it in a way that has pagan overtones. And this, of course, begins before Constantine's conversion to Christianity, but it continues afterwards as well. In fact, the connection to pagan gods continues for more than a decade after Constantine's apparently become Christian. And as late as 324, he's still sponsoring coins that show Sol Invictus. And so this coin, issued in 320, you can see on the reverse of this coin the picture of Sol Invictus. But once Constantine is fully in control, Licinius is defeated, what we then see is something different. We see Constantine moving away from the representations of pagan gods, and now on the back is just simply an image of a winged victory. And once Constantine is fully in control, he feels free to demonstrate his Christianity in more public ways. So he calls the Church Council of Nicaea in 325 as a way to use imperial power to deal with a major church conflict. He endowed major churches, so St. Peter's was a Constantinian project. And he also gave a palace to the Pope. He banned crucifixion, of course, for obvious reasons, because of its connection to the death of Jesus. He banned branding on the face, because he felt that faces disfigured were disfiguring people made in the image of God. He gave churches the power to make wills valid, and he encouraged and helped Christians get positions in administration. But he also still made use of pagans, because pagans are a majority in the empire, by far. Most senators were pagan, the leader of most cities were pagan, city councils were largely pagan, and there are ways that you can see how these pagans understood what Constantine is doing. So I'll give you a piece of evidence right now that shows how Constantine made use of these prominent pagans and what they thought about Constantine. So this is a piece of graffiti that was put in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And it's written by a man who calls himself the torchbearer of the holy mysteries at Eleusis. I, Nicogoras, the son of Minucianus from Athens, viewed and admired the galleries many ages after the time of the divine Plato from Athens, and I was grateful to the gods and to the most pious Emperor Constantine, who furnished me with this opportunity. May Plato be gracious here also. Now, Nicogoras, the son of Minucianus, is a sophist, a teacher of rhetoric in Athens, and he's also very clearly a pagan. So it's notable to see how he describes Constantine. Constantine, described by this pagan, is the most pious Emperor Constantine. And so he's described in pagan terms by a pagan. In other ways, we see that Constantine doesn't do anything to actively counteract paganism or repress paganism. He just takes away some official support for it. So sacrifices continue to be performed legally, and despite what Eusebius says, the only legislation on Roman law, in Roman law books that we have from Constantine about religious practice is this: if it should appear that any part of our palace or any other public work has been struck by lightning, the observance of the ancient custom shall be retained. An inquiry shall be made of the soothsayers as to the portent of it. Permission shall be granted to all other persons also to appropriate this custom to themselves, provided only that they abstain from private sacrifices which are specifically prohibited. So instead of banning sacrifices, Constantine is here actually requiring the use of pagan divination to understand certain occurrences, in particular the imperial palace or other public buildings being struck by lightning. And it seems that this probably relates to the Colosseum being struck by lightning. Constantine is also allowing other people to do this. They are allowed explicitly to do divination as long as they do it in public. So they cannot do it in private, but the prohibition against people doing divination in private had extended at least as far as the reign of Augustus. So there's nothing at all Christian or new about that prohibition. So I think when we read Eusebius, we need to be aware of this larger context. Because in addition to requiring traditional pagan practices in certain contexts, Constantine remained the chief priest of public religion at Rome, as every emperor had since Augustus. He was the highest pagan religious official in the empire, and he never turned that title down. And so what you see is a picture of Constantine that for Christians looks one way, for pagans looks a different way. And as we also can see, the question of Constantine's baptism is a real one. So as Eusebius describes, Constantine is baptized right before he dies. And this might seem strange to us, but in antiquity it was not. Because the idea of baptism is that baptism washes away sins, and it can only happen once. So why not wait until you probably are not going to sin again? And this is especially true of an emperor whose job on some level requires them sinning. They have to sanction capital punishment and order people to do other things that may be sins. And so this leaves some people, both ancient and modern, to question the sincerity of Constantine's conversion. So a pagan perspective on this comes from the Emperor Julian, who writes about Constantine that Constantine found Jesus, who'd taken up his abode with incontinence, and cried loud to all, "He that is a seducer, he that is a murderer, he that is sacrilegious and infamous, let him approach me without fear, for with this water I wash him away, and will straightway make him clean. And though he should be guilty of these sins a second time, let him just beat his breast, and I will make him clean again." And to him, Constantine came gladly. Now, Julian is a pagan who is the nephew of Constantine. He eventually becomes emperor, but he disliked Constantine intensely because after Constantine's death, there's a purging of all of the male relatives that are not sons of Constantine, and this included Julian's father. And so Julian blames Constantine for this and sees Constantine as genuinely a horrible person who embraced Jesus because he was so foul and so full of sin that no other god would take him. But this portrait of Constantine is something that is, of course, polemical. This is an attack on Constantine by somebody who really, really disliked him. Instead, I think what we have to do is step back and think about whether Constantine's conversion to Christianity makes sense. And given the context in which it happened, the war against Maxentius, the really extreme chance that Constantine might not succeed, and the likelihood of death if Constantine did not succeed, the conversion does seem to make sense. And so when you see a contrary account of Constantine's approach to Christianity, one that is grounded in cynicism, what that misses is the very real and very plausible story that Constantine would embrace Christianity, in a sense, out of desperation. But once that embrace of Christianity resulted in the victory over Maxentius, it makes complete sense that Constantine would remain true to this faith that had won him that great achievement.